I'm honored to invite the head of the INSS, Professor Manuel Trachtenberg, to open the conference. Please. Hello, and welcome to this important conference, I hope. The subject cannot be more current than Saudi Arabia between Iran and Israel, no more and no less. I will not count all the important guests among us. I always forget someone. I will suffice with welcoming all of you, also the viewers at home. This conference was planned about 4 months ago, much before the subject was raised in the headlines, as has happened recently. There are two possibilities. One is that the INSS has a crystal ball that told the future, or that we were lucky. You can decide at the end of the conference what brought us to this position. But also, without the rumors of the headlines about the contacts, perhaps negotiations between all those involved to reach some kind of a more formal agreements between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States. Even without this, lately, there have been some dramatic changes in the region, which Saudi Arabia has had an important and central role. What is happening in the region that is bringing us to this discussion? First of all, everyone is talking with everyone, which was not the case before. We are talking about a kind of regional détente, yes, a term borrowed from the previous century that has enabled the diplomatic priority. The diplomatic priority has enabled ties instead of conflicts, and instead of the use of force. Iran is suddenly part of the game, and it returns to be a major player vis-a-vis all the others. Syria is returning to the arena after 12 years of being on the sidelines and of hoping that Assad would disappear. And here the same Assad is returning, is being welcomed in Riyadh, in the Arab League, an event that is difficult to exaggerate its significance. China is playing an important role in the region. Suddenly, China is negotiating between Saudi Arabia and Iran to have ties. And of course, the United States, which is busy with other regions, it's not going anywhere. It is here, and it's still an important force, and it will not give up its relevance in shaping the new map of the region. And to all this, we will add the contacts that are taking place between us and Saudi Arabia on having relations or some kind of arrangement. And this is the holy grail, not only of the diplomatic relations, but if this happens, it is the acceptance of Israel in the region. Really, it's not just a cold peace here and there, but another place for us. Perhaps we can get rid of that image of the villa in the jungle. If this takes place, it will be a game changer. There is no doubt that we are in a moment of time that could be historic from our perspective. Of course, on the way, there are quite a few difficulties. There are 3 players: the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Each one has its own demands, problems, and red lines. Saudi Arabia is requesting from the United States the sale of the most advanced weapons. They are even discussing, and who knows if it's true, the collapse of the defense alliance between the two countries. This would have great consequences. The development of nuclear capability, they say, in order to produce nuclear fuel that will serve Saudi Arabia when oil is no longer relevant. Moreover, what Saudi Arabia seeks is its acceptance and the embrace of America. Indeed, 5 years ago, after the murder of the journalist Khashoggi, it became truly excluded from America, big time, of course, by the Democratic administration. Between Saudi Arabia and Israel, there is the Palestinian issue. The resumption of some kind of process of dialogue, a political process. The word peace is championed by all of us, but something in that direction. Maintaining the status quo on the Temple Mount, and of course avoiding provocative actions in these contexts, which with this coalition composition are difficult to avoid. And between the United States and Israel as well, there's a set of conditions, of demands, some of which overlap, as with the Palestinian issue, but some not, such as the legal reform or the regime overhaul, which of course the United States does not approve of, and suddenly everything is connected to everything. In this conference, we will address two main motifs. The topic is broad. One is to try to map and understand the changes in the region. To try in the region, I mean mainly in the Gulf, but not only, and of course those transformations that concern Saudi Arabia. The second theme or motif is the derivatives of those changes in the region, particularly of Saudi Arabia, on Israel, on its status in the region, on the prospects of establishing relations. We at the INSS deal with these issues all the time. So when I said at the beginning of my remarks after the jokes, whether it was a big crystal ball or luck, it was of course neither. When you deal with these things intensively all the time, then obviously when something significant happens, you're ready, you have something to say, yes, and we are there. Our intention, of course, at this conference, as in any activity that we do, is not just academic. It is not research for research's sake. We want to influence what is happening in the state of Israel, to formulate policies that will lead us to a better place in advancing Israel's national interests. And I want to point out one thing in this context. There are quite a few in Israel who are looking at the establishment of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc., between all the possible couples of they are looking at it as if it's dangerous for the state of Israel. It could be, but this Pavlovian reaction is out of place. This needs to be investigated. The merits of the matter need to be addressed. There may be opportunities here that we didn't think of in advance. So here at the INSS, this is what we do. We don't treat everything with instinct and immediately saying it's dangerous and whatnot. I would like to thank Dr. Yoel Gudzansky, the organizer of the conference. You know, when you come here 5 to 4, you come, you sit behind this event, and there is more than a little work and planning and thought. So I want to thank you and everyone else who made this happen. I would like to thank the honorable guests who've done things here. Yossi Cohen, my friend, the former head of the Mossad and former head of the National Security Council. Thank you. To our friends from Tel Aviv University, to Professor Uzi Rabi, director of the Dayan Center, to Dr. Brandon Friedman, head of the research division, also of the Dayan Center, to Dr. Leora Handelman-Braver, head of the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies, to Ronen Levy, director of the Foreign Ministry, who will close the conference with his conclusion. I wish everyone an enjoyable, useful conference, and I hope at the end of it, we will leave with a smile and not just worry. Thank you. Thank you, Mano. I want to introduce the next speaker, the former head of the Mossad and former head of the National Security Council. The title of Yossi's lecture is A New Order in the Middle East. Mano hinted at this, and Yossi will expand upon it. In 1982, Yossi Cohen joined the Mossad. He successfully passed the course Commander's Collection, and he advanced in the Mossad until he was appointed head of the Mossad in Europe. In 2006, he was appointed to the head of the Collection Division, Hatzometz, the wing of activating the Mossad agents, and in 2011, he was appointed deputy head of the Mossad. In 2013, he was appointed head of the National Security Council, and in 2016, Cohen was appointed as the head of the Mossad. One of the prominent operations when Cohen was the head of the Mossad was acquiring the Iranian nuclear documents, the nuclear archives, which he led and oversaw personally. Revealing the documents was one of the main reasons why the United States left the Iranian nuclear agreement. In 2020, Cohen led the contacts with the Emirates and Bahrain, the more meaningful ties that he created, which were then signed into the Abraham Accords. Yossi, please. Good afternoon to all of the honorable audience, to my friend Manuel Trachtenberg. We've met in the past and we've worked in the past. Thank you. Professor Uzi Rabi, I had the pleasure of appearing before you at the important Dayan Center. To my friend Major General Tamir Heyman, to the Ambassador of Bahrain in Israel, my dear friend, His Excellency, welcome to our humble INSS Summit. I will go immediately to the former head of the Mossad, Ephraim Halevi. Welcome to everyone. I won't go over the list of honorable people here. I was asked to speak in Hebrew, and those who don't know Hebrew will receive simultaneous English translation. We will try to take a piece of the crystal ball that Professor Trachtenberg spoke of to see if there is a practical meaning to all that is happening around us in the arena. I think those who see real intelligence, we are already retired, the Major General and myself, we are still in the need of formal intelligence, but we can also try to understand insights from the past and the present, from what we see, perhaps, in a less formal way. In the past, these presentations began with a question mark when we wrote A New World Order in the Middle East. It was to ask if there was a new order in the Middle East. Why? Because we got used to two peace agreements only, between us and our neighbors from the east and the south, Egypt in the 1970s and Jordan in the 1990s. An agreement, if you wish, the Oslo Agreement, which was supposed to lead to a much greater process, and then everything stopped. During many years, we didn't see anything that would lead us to a new world order in the Middle East. This thing is now taking place. Things that we dreamt about in the past are taking place now, and we are watching them continue to happen. We chose to focus on something that Professor Trachtenberg mentioned, the U.S. presence in the arena. The U.S. presence in the arena was seemingly, we can say, on a practical level, certainly as Israelis, a presence without borders, especially after there was an exit of other countries from the Middle East. Following the agreement with Egypt, the United States replaced Russia in the arena, other powers disappeared, and the United States came to dominate. This happened over many years, only now we're having a different experience. The first experience that we are experiencing, we can see as a result of the Arab Spring, the wrongly named Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, which began in Tunisia, you remember, went south to Egypt, Mubarak, Morsi, El-Sisi in the current period. Upheavals upon upheavals. It goes northwards to Syria, and in Syria we begin to see the unacceptable to us, to humanity. President Assad kills his people with gas, with nerve gas, with mustard gas, and we are furious. The United States does not handle this in an acceptable military manner, as we had remembered the U.S. dealing with events like this before. Instead, it uses the Russian capabilities, and it calls Russia back into the Middle East. And it's now present, invited by Western powers and by President Assad, and it sits here, not far. Tamir, you remember we had a discussion about how to remove the Revolutionary Guards from the Israeli border, and who entered between us as a buffer. It was in reality Russian military police. Russian military police stood between us and the lower border of the Revolutionary Guards in Syria itself. A new actor that you cannot ignore in the arena, who comes up in every discussion. China arises in the discussion. China enters as a very serious player. We will see it at the end of the presentation. The Chinese presence exists. It exists and the world cannot ignore it. A question: who can tell me the world policy towards China? The American policy towards China. China controls with its Thai arm the world of semiconductors and chips. You remember all the silicon. China is present not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of policy. We'll get to that soon. We cannot ignore it. We left the map on the screen. Look at the size of Iran.
Not the regular Pavlovian response of what do we do with Iran? Look at the size of Iran. It can easily cover 80-90% of Europe with its size. It's a huge country, a very sophisticated population. Colleagues here in the audience, my former colleagues in the Mossad, know this. These people, scientists, they believe in education, a nation that believes in academic studies. They believe in broadening or deepening the understanding or the influence of the Shiite axis in the region. I don't know if there is such a vision, but practice shows that they do this throughout the region, southern Iraq, passing armaments and rockets into Syria, and from there into this purple country called Lebanon, the hands of Hezbollah. This Shiite axis is done. In fact, Iran does it, even though they're sanctioned very heavily. They fund it and they do it, and we can deal with this later. And there's much to be learned and much to be realized about the Russian-Ukraine war. There's a war that maybe it's similar to the Middle East. And what does the West do there? What is the response of NATO to the war between Russia and Ukraine? What do we do to counter, if you will, the Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine? Mainly arming Ukraine, but physically a physical war? Less. So when you look at dominance that was in the past, and maybe still in existence today, we have new players that we see in the region. In the past, we used to look at India as a different version, different kind of country. First, it became to the biggest country in the world as far as its population. If I'm not mistaken, close to 1.5 billion human beings. When we accumulate everything we have on the map, these flags alone, compared to the Western world, what we called, we reach half the population of the world, nominally. 1.5 billion in India, 1.3 billion Chinese, add Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Indonesia, all these other Muslim countries that are not necessarily aligned with the West and the values that we believe in. And you will see a nominal influence that is intensifying of countries that are not, how should we put it, don't bow their heads to the values, to the esteemed values of the West. You could say, yes, as an example, yes, you put severe sanctions on Russia, India says. We are not necessarily playing along with this game. China certainly not. And you see contacts between our former colleagues and diplomats in the senior levels in both countries, or the 5 countries that I discussed, that are trying to organize a different kind of arrangement that does not bow its head to what we knew in the past. United States will say and everyone will do. I'm not sure that this sentence still holds. Without looking at what's happening practically on the ground. We're still in the Middle East, friendly countries, and some that are less friendly. I'm moving to the next issue to explain maybe the new order. This is a slide. This picture, I think, is very powerful. It's also very modern. It happened less than a year ago. Half a year ago, to be exact, December 2022. There is a significant spirit of Arab countries, theoretically the Arab League or extended Arab League, way beyond the Arab League. At its center, Xi Jinping, president of China, we call it the ruler. You can use different terms to call him. The Chinese leader. This teaches us something that is not here, but it should be said maybe in the background of this image. Remember the visit of President of the United States in the region. Remember the picture of 2 fists. President Biden with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince, standing in the center of this picture. We are in a place where Saudi Arabia, that this is the discussion of the day here, and we're reaching this topic now, identifies other players. Not only identifies other players, but is willing to talk to them. They won't hide this anymore. They won't do it behind closed doors. They won't hide it and say, we don't have, but we do have. The MBS, with all his glory, with his known problems in the past that Professor Trachtenberg discussed, stands on the front line, on the stage, a young man, 37 years. We know what he did. We know his next role. His nomination is guaranteed. I don't think anything's going to change. Standing and leading something else. And his new leadership, as we see it now, is by his side. I'm just telling you, notice there is an alternative. I translate this slide as saying, yes, I don't disregard the United States, but there are alternatives, friends. You don't want to sell me F-35? I have other options. You won't give me financial support and maybe enter me, you want to sanction me like you did with other countries? I'm just telling you, or sending you a signal. I, too, like my friends, Arab countries, have alternatives, and I won't hesitate to cooperate and to seize the opportunities behind them. The other issue, of course, the meeting. Also, this happened on December 22. This created some kind of a change, if you will, in the perception of Saudi Arabia. And we're going out with this. We're taking this forward. We in the intelligence community saw all along the contacts between Saudi Arabia and almost all countries of the world. I didn't see them. I don't remember these contacts so overt at the front of the stage. MBS says we're not shy anymore. Here's China. Here's Saudi Arabia. Here we are. This is something that I think sends a very powerful message that it could be, and this maybe are the bottom lines of this issue, that why does the United States want to talk to Saudi Arabia all of a sudden? What's the hurry? Something else happened, maybe more interesting. And that I think you related to this, Manu, correctly. There is an issue here that we, if you allow me, we saw this for many, many years. And I just want to remind the wrong Pavlovian responses, I think are wrong. What happened? Saudi Arabia talked to others. And by the way, I used to speak to my counterpart, and we knew each other very well. We didn't shake hands, never. But he's the head of the Iranian National Security Council. When I was head of Mossad, he was there. We know him and his opinions. But Iran, like Iran, after the era of Rouhani, despite Raisi, known the butcher or the hanger from Tehran or other horrific titles, Iran knows how to speak softly with the West. They did this in the first Obama administration. In his first term, they did this in the second engagement with the Obama administration in July 2015 and reached the JCPOA. They speak to the West, the P5+1, as we know very well. And there is sometimes a debate, was it right or was it wrong to disengage from leave the agreement, yes or no? Is it good? Is it bad? That's not for now. Iran knows how to speak diplomatically. They learn the game. And when they learn the game, and when their foreign presence, if you will, now, as we have now, the Chinese presence comes back or comes to the fore so powerfully to the Middle East, MBS asks himself, he didn't consult with me, but I'm sure he asks himself, according to foreign reports we met, and I don't approve this, but he's a thinking man, he asks himself, MBS, who will broker the deal? What am I left with, he will ask himself. I am threatened. My military might exists. Maybe it is weaker compared to the Iranians. It's not that I didn't have contacts with Iran in the past. There were relations, almost even full relations up until 2016. There was a problem. We softened our relations or reduced the relations. We want to come back to center stage now. The JCPOA, that was a serious issue. J5+1 was China, Russia, United States. Think about this. Germany, England, UK, Germany, IAEA supported intelligence-wise or practically from the outside, maybe as a nuclear tribunal, if you will. And the agreement was signed. This bunch can't organize for him at the current time, maybe doesn't want to arrange contact with Iran that is again under sanction regime. But this is happening now. And center stage you have the Iranian National Security Advisor close to Khamenei today. We have Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Saudi Minister of Foreign Affairs, the most senior politician in the high diplomacy, and the Chinese senior leadership, and they're all back in close relations. I agree that when we look at this as Israelis, we see two images that make sense. One, oh no, they are collaborating with the enemy. And second, is this distancing our opportunities to sign with Saudi Arabia future peace agreements? I'll tell you what I think later. And then we ask the questions. Will this issue, everything that happened, is it necessarily against Israel? Are we going to be influenced by this renewed connection that was, and as I said, re-emerged and came front stage? Another question. Do we understand why Saudi Arabia is doing it? I showed before the map. I showed you the interests. What does Saudi Arabia gain from this bilateral connection with Iran? It's very clear. Iran is not a country that you are in the region and that you want to fight with it, okay? You don't want to clash with Iran. We have here with us the Bahrainian ambassador, a good friend, and the Bahrainian king was one of the brave people of the Middle East that signed a peace agreement with us as a small and threatened country, threatened by Iran, in and out. And sitting nearby, we're talking about Cyprus sometimes, see how physically Cyprus is to us? It's much closer, they are much closer to Iran than we are to Cyprus. Sometimes it's 20 miles. Some Persian Gulf countries to Iran are very close. When Iran develops such a powerful military might and the ability to negatively penetrate these countries, you necessarily have to develop answers. So, is a relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, does this have to do with Israel? I believe, and this is my truth, I say no. I think that what Israel here must do is to try to go into their shoes or into their mind and understand that their purpose is not to tell us that we are farther away, but to tell us, listen carefully, guys, understand us. By the way, France and Germany have embassies in Iran. What does that mean? Is this against Israel? The Netherlands has an embassy inside of Tehran. Does this mean anything towards Israel? Of course not. So Saudi Arabia is the same thing. Things have to happen bilaterally that do not necessarily influence the state of Israel at the current time. And so to the largest question, without a crystal ball, what someone once told me, hope is not a work plan, okay? Is normalization of Saudi Arabia and Israel, is this possible? I assess, and am based here on personal knowledge on the matter, certainly possible. Absolutely possible. In the Middle East, there is a new age where brave leadership like the Bahraini king, other brave like Mohammed bin Zayed of the UAE, other like the current king of Morocco, and there were a few other efforts in Sudan, which is also crumbling again, but also the Sudanese signed a deal with us. Brave leaders know how to create normalization, and I think they are present, they are there. And with these, I think we can create something that is big and important. Another issue, and we tried to synthesize questions that came to our desk about the nuclear deal. 5 minutes do I have? Nuclear deal, yes, no. As I think there is no vitality to the nuclear deal. This happens because, positively or negatively, because of new information that surfaced, that proved that Iran was facing a nuclear bomb or bombs. This has been carefully learned about unmonitored sites that weren't disclosed to the IAEA, activities that we didn't know, scientists that we didn't know of their existence and their actions. IAEA itself says, this way we cannot sign a deal. Come clean, they tell Iran. Tell us, answer these questions, everything you didn't answer in the past. For instance, all the potential PMD, potential military dimension, everything that is colored nuclear or militarily nuclear. Explain to us what our intelligence means, some of it through Israel, and see if we can go back to a deal, yes or no. Are these things related? I think it's a different axis that is not necessarily tied. If the brokerage of the deal with Iran, the relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, was under the auspices of the West, I would tend to think that there is a direct or indirect relation to the nuclear deal. Here I see no connection. Of course, we spoke about China as a central power. The same thing, by the way, these are the national security advisors of both countries. On the left, of course, you know him. You saw him in the previous image. Shamahani, he is the national security advisor in Iran. And on the right of the image, you see Sheikh Tahnun bin Zayed, the head of the National Security Council. He was, someone in the audience says he was dismissed. Okay, Mazel Tov, he's retired. Is receiving a full pension. And on the right, by the way, dismissing someone in Iran, you know what this means. Sometimes it's a cycle. You're out and you're back in, like other countries. On the right, National Security Advisor of Abu Dhabi. Let's put it this way. Nothing negative I can say about our relation with Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. Nothing. I think that these relations are peace. Perfect peace. We understood, we signed, we finalized things, we spoke clandestinely for a long time, we brought it out to the light, we signed agreements, and Abu Dhabi understands. And we saw this for a long time, that there's one threat from the East that you cannot disregard. And when you can't disregard, or you don't want to disregard the threats from the East, there's one thing you need to do, that is talk. So this negativity or this threat won't emerge from the East. You have to take into consideration their size and their regional interests. An image that repeats itself now, we saw China signing an agreement or brokering an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now we see Raisi, as we know very well, the famous Raisi. Also here we see countries that tell themselves or tell others, we have a different world view, a worldview of higher interest than maybe we had in the past, and we're not ashamed to state them overtly for all to see. These are the leaders, the brave leaders so far. I think also here there was a lot of bravery. MBS approves overflights of Air India from Tel Aviv to New Delhi, crossing over Saudi Arabia. He approved it personally. These are trust-building measures. There were other trust-building measures along the way. I know El Al also wants to fly, and hopefully we will reach that too. There are other things we need to do in order to get everyone used to the country itself and the population of the new reality. Another issue is about the Palestinian issue, the Israeli arena, other components that are all an important influential aspect of bringing Saudi Arabia to the table. We have one holy site in the Islamic world called Haram al-Sharif or Temple Mount. They have two. And they're not certain to this point that the Muslim world will forgive them, and they keep checking the water to see what peace agreements in Israel will do to their stance in the Muslim world because of Mecca and Medina, the two important holy sites in Saudi Arabia. I think there are a few other large issues or questions that we would need to deal with, take out our many crystal balls the best we can. One huge issue that's happening, going on almost 2 years, the Ukraine-Russia war. I met a senior American a few weeks ago. We had a debate in the room. There were also representatives of, official representatives of neighboring countries in the Middle East. And we asked him, sir, what do you think is going to happen with the Ukraine-Russia war? And he said, I'm translating, I fear that in a year from now you will ask me the same question. And I will answer you the same thing in a year's time. Henry Kissinger said the only missing component here is a broker. Someone needs to cut the deal. Someone needs to make this connection that will probably not finish with some glorious victory of the Russians or the Ukrainians. Ukraine is being destroyed, 20 million refugees. Russia is standing strong. Also, Ukraine is standing, but differently. And the end, who knows what the end will be. The other question about the nuclear deal, I don't see, as of now, the deal coming back in its previous form, unless IAEA, as I said, will approve it. We didn't talk about it, but we should discuss the issue of NATO's place in the modern world, a pact that was made in 1945, and the Warsaw Pact that is not existence anymore. And even Finland now joined. Finland that always preserved its neutrality with its Russian neighbor now joined NATO 2023. What is its role then? When no one, by the way, or maybe not by the way, maybe this is the essence, are not willing to help physically Ukraine in the world, not willing to fight its fight? Excellent question about the role of this great organization. They were also very strongly present in Afghanistan and other players. These are two images that I chose to conclude my presentation with. They both explained, self-explanatory. This is the peace agreement on the White House lawn. I was there, excited. I was right here, the bottom of the picture. I sat there, tears in my eyes. I was moved. You see the President of the United States, Prime Minister of Israel, two ministers from Bahrain, UAE, historic peace agreements, I must say. And on the other side, an image that emphasizes a bit of the current era on a new dominant broker and no less significant. Bottom line, I assess a normalization deal, peace treaty with Saudi Arabia is possible. I am carefully stating, because I don't base my comments on current intelligence, I assess that these contacts, if they are monitored carefully, brokered well, with positive good guarantees by the United States, with also the right things said about the Palestinian arena, but without concrete commitments to moves on the ground, because this is more complicated on all sides. I think this is needed and possible. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite Professor Uzi Rabi, the head of the Dayan Center, Major General in Reserves, Amir Iman, Director of the INSS. Hello, distinguished gentlemen. The Middle East is changing its face. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Yossi just described how the Middle East is changing its face. There are various arrangements that are maturing, and their main purpose is a detente and bringing back Syria into the Arab League, the renewal of the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, improving the relations of the Arab sphere with Qatar. You can't hear me well? Now you can? Okay. So all these things started several years ago and have recently matured. And this is not the end of the process as well. Certain dialogue, certain contexts have started, accelerated contexts regarding putting an end to the war in Yemen, trying to find their way between Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Syria, and even Hamas and Saudi Arabia are warming up their relations. So recently, currently, the countries of the region prefer diplomacy over an armed conflict as a way to achieve their goals. And by the way, their goals haven't changed, only the means, the methods have changed. It's important to emphasize that's what's happening in the region. This detente is not a deep reconciliation, but it's a detente, the thawing of tensions on the surface without resolving the deep-rooted causes that could and probably will erupt in the future. This detente is led by Mohammed bin Salman, who's preparing the ground for his crowning, and he wants to unite around him the entire Arab world, the entire Western world, and he's willing to use traditional means of impact of Saudi Arabia, financing, brokering, and is abandoning, or perhaps that's what I hope, he's abandoning any futile attempts to change the reality in the Middle East through forceful means. Gentlemen, I'd like to ask you, we can see this détente led by Saudi Arabia. The process didn't start today, and it's not going to end at any time soon, and it includes Arab countries and other countries and non-state organizations. What are the reasons for this trend, in your view? Well, I'll start. Just as you aptly described it, there's an issue here that's, not so much the fraternity, this new fraternity between nations and a new vision of a different Middle East, but rather what we have here, we're facing two phenomena that are turning into something new. One is, we can call it the waning of the regional upheaval, as Yossi called it. At the beginning, we called it the Arab Spring, and then it turned into the Islamic Autumn. And then in the Intel Directorate, they called it upheaval phase 1, upheaval phase 2, and then upheaval phase 3. And that's been exhausted. And I think that the upheaval has come to an end, and we're entering this new stabilization. And what's happening in Sudan right now, and one could also call it something highly unstable. That's old school. That's two generals fighting over the dominance over the country. All that energy that came from the general population kind of dissipated into this stability. And the other element is the narrative of American withdrawal from the Middle East. And I'm calling it a narrative on purpose because when you count the boots on the ground, it's less factually based, but there is this mindset, and it's based on what the Americans are saying, as well as their definitions that they are tending towards focusing more on China and Russia and in the global tech competition, and their focus is being shifted from the Middle East. And as you have these two things happening, there's another thing that's happening that's reducing the damage capability of three countries. There are three countries that it's been proven have a great capacity for damage. One of them is Iran, and I think that the turning point was in attacking the facilities at Aramco. This strike, which occurred in September 2019, a few months after the sanctions over Iranian oil were reimposed, that demonstrated the capacity for damage and how much the Gulf countries are exposed to the U.S. special capabilities. Saudi Arabia has proven a damage capacity in its soft influence on the recent riots in Iran. It doesn't matter how effective it was for the Iranians, the external influence of the Saudi media network on the hijab protest was a genuine threat, and Syria is demonstrating its damage capacity through the export of the Captagon. It's become a narco state, and the drugs flowing out from Syria are influencing and impacting the Middle East. So when the landlord has kinda left, and when everybody can harm everybody else, the best thing would be to decide, let's decide that we're going to stop harming each other. I think this is the main thing that's happening. Okay, I'm addressing the same question to you, Uzi. Well, I definitely agree with that. Let me just say that when one examines what's happening in the Middle East in 2023 in terms of the equation of the superpowers in the Middle East, we are in a formative moment. As you go over the past 200 years in the Middle East, it would be very difficult for you to find a situation in which there isn't any major Western dominance or presence. Now, Tamir said that it's a narrative, and I accept that. But the problem is that in the mindset of the Arab countries, and we've already mentioned Saudi Arabia, for the first time is finding itself in a completely new situation. First of all, with respect to the superpower balance of power, Saudi Arabia doesn't know how to conduct in the Middle East without some kind of an American support. On this chair, as I lean back, I sit completely different, and I'll need to sit in a completely different posture if there isn't any back support. And Saudi Arabia are sitting, holding on tightly, and they understand one thing, and this is something very important, and the Bchek and Ras Tanura have already been mentioned, and these are oil centers in Saudi Arabia that have been attacked by pro-Iranian militias, and ultimately it went unnoticed, as they say. Americans, that they would have gone on a world war over such a thing in the 20th century. It passed without any reaction. That should be our point, our opening point when we talk about Saudi Arabia, because in its geopolitical experience, it is going through a formative, even traumatic moment, and it actually needs to find in this great distress a different pattern of action. And let's connect this to what Yoel said at the beginning. We all know Mohammed bin Salman. He was a controversial guy, let's put it very blunt. Somebody with a presence, with a statement. And the Saudis tried other things in recent years. They were in Lebanon with Hariri. They were in Syria with the insurgents. They invested a lot of money there. They were leading the camp that wanted to topple Bashar al-Assad. And of course, that the Yemen swamp was the great saga or fiasco. In all these cases, what I call excessive proactivity, proaction, in order to cover themselves in view of the waning of what they consider to be American presence. And this proactivity ended up as a failure. And this is why I agree with what you're actually saying. In Saudi history, this issue of wallet policy or brokerage diplomacy, these are things that we know from Ben Salman's grandfather, who was the founder of the kingdom, and from his uncle Faisal. They actually turned this into something which is part of the recognizing trait of Saudi Arabia. And when you add to all that the X factor, which is Ben Salman, you'll find a Saudi movement which we haven't seen before. So this is why the Saudi Arabia we're seeing in the Middle East today, it definitely has pretensions. It definitely believes that it should be leading a line here. And yet, this is a country with a lot of noise from within. It's important to remember that Ben Salman is about to be king, but he needs to take care of two very important places, and that's called Umara and Ulama, clergymen and princes. That's the alliance which is the foundation of the Saudi state. And one of the things that Ben Salman is establishing here is a technocratic elite that will be with him and will prevent dangerous combinations, whether it's free radicals from the religious side or various rival factions from the monarchy. And Saudi Arabia is definitely a country we need to keep an eye on. And this dance here is a different dance, and it's adapted to the circumstances from within and from without. And you cannot define it in the terms of Saudi Arabia of the past. This is something new, and you, I think, will definitely discuss this with respect to the new points of emphasis in Saudi America that require that we understand it differently. Instead of shooting bullets, they're now shooting diplomacy. The decade of the Arab Spring has come to an end. Proxy or direct wars has come to an end, and a new decade is beginning, perhaps the decade of the détente. The Middle East is complex, sometimes chaotic. Actors are hedging the risks. They wish not to be identified with any side. How should the Israeli government behave in view of these dramatic changes in the region? What advice can you give? Tamir, look, we cannot hedge. So this issue of diversifying strategic supports, it's not in line with Israel's national security interest, which has set for itself the existence of one superpower. Over the years, it's not how it started out, but the U.S. as a main superpower backing, we mustn't, be confused about that for even a second. Narratives are one thing, and by the way, just to properly respect the Americans here. A few months after they did not respond to the strike at Aramco, they targeted and killed Qasem Soleimani, and that was exceeded the expectations of all players in the Middle East, and that gave a grace of yet another year, I think, in the American determination and might. So we can't say that the Americans are obsolete in the region. As far as Israel is concerned, talking about diversifying our supports, that's causing us damage vis-a-vis the American regime. I think we must conduct ourselves very wisely, because there's the competition between the superpowers on technology, the competition between China, which is a main trade partner for Israel, and the U.S. We must do so in a very smart and accurate way. But we shouldn't diversify our strategic supports. As for the Middle East and the Gulf countries, it's already been said they don't really have a choice. Their capabilities require that, and perhaps for them this is something that's the right thing to do. I suggest we don't adapt it to the Israeli system. The Israeli system or method is that we're part of the liberal Western world, or half of the world, as we securely rely on the U.S., but with our eyes open, and we are advancing our interests based on our need. So how should Israel respond to the changes? Look, I think that we live at a time, and I do not wish to be too melodramatic, but I would never have believed that what is happening in recent years will actually happen. I think a miracle, or at least half a miracle, has happened to Israel in the Middle East, and Yossi showed this in his presentation. He showed a series of leaders, and it doesn't really matter who's whom, but they all crossed the Rubicon. As far as they're concerned, Israel is not an enemy, and for most of them, if not for all of them, except for the Qatari, Israel is also someone or something they need to cooperate with in order to advance their interest. Let me go with your line of thinking about detente. I think we've seen in recent decades, and I think when Arab friends, often when they would talk with me about current affairs in the Middle East, it would always end with a statement, especially in the last decade after the Arab Spring, with an Arabic comment or expression. It's very light. Kul wahed lahalu. Kul wahed lahalu. Each one to his own. And this is exactly what you're seeing, Yoel. We don't have any blocks any longer. I don't remember who said that, you or Yossi or Tamir, but in the Israeli way of thinking, or the Israeli mindset, automatically when Israelis hear that there is an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, they said, okay, that's the end of the Abraham Accords. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction. But that's what's new in the Middle East, that you can sign a contract like this with Iran if you're called Saudi Arabia, and I can explain why. But I think that it has nothing to do with the chances that there will or won't be normalization with Saudi Arabia. And I think, I was in many of the countries involved in the Abraham Accords. I visited many of these places, including Morocco. We have countries here that understand Mother Earth as a main enemy, and connecting with Israel, that means connecting with these labs. And it's important to understand, if Israel acts wisely, it has a great future ahead of it in the Middle East. And of course, this wisdom has to come along with modesty and humility, and with the right way of thinking, that we need to understand the people on the other side. And of course, very carefully, very cautiously, we need to be respectful as well, to do everything in a very respectful manner, and to also understand the way all the other actors are heading. Since we have an atomist, an atom-based system, we don't have any blocks. Each country has its own particular interest, and I'll say this in the most simplistic manner. Israel is like a phone switchboard that you're actually connecting with whatever place you need to, and then you disconnect with what you don't need to, and you handle a difficult challenge whenever you need to. And I think that we here still stand a great chance. It's true that Saudi Arabia, I disagree that the Palestinian issue is a red line for the Saudi Arabians. In order to be nice, I won't tell you what I think even more on that, but let me tell you what they're looking for. The Saudis, of course, they don't object to an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, and it's important to have some kind of an agreement on that. But at the end of the day, the Saudis, that's my take, that's my reading, maybe I'm wrong, but that's my opinion. They want to see the days of Nixon and Kissinger. They want the umbrella very strongly behind them, maybe the F-35, yes or no. But given the fact that these things could happen, and this is why it depends on the U.S., normalization is definitely on the table. I just wish to cool your enthusiasm. It will be done in the Saudi pace, not in the Emirates pace, and that means that it's going to be something very, very incremental, and we definitely need to aspire and wish for that, because that's definitely a game changer and it will completely change the ballpark we're playing. I knew he would speak about the Palestinians, and this is why I picked up the mic in advance. I completely agree with you that the agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran does not prevent normalization. And we have the best proof for that in the United Emirates. They renewed diplomatic relations with Iran. A few months ago, they exchanged ambassadors, and they had some lovely photographs, just as lovely as the photos we saw before. And nothing happened to the peace accords between us and the UAE. It's continuing in a positive and thriving trend. So after they took off that monkey from their shoulder, and once they've secured their border with Iran, they're much more flexible and open to turn to Israel and see whatever they can do with it. But there are two obstacles to the normalization. One is the American obstacle, and the second is the Palestinian obstacle. And I think that with respect to the American issue, I guess Uzi and I think the same. They have leverage. This leverage allows them to put some very important bargaining chips on the table. That includes full control over the circle of nuclear fuel. And what they're saying, it's also criticism on the West, because you are permitting Iran to have a nuclear weapons cycle because there is no agreement, and they have full capability. So Iran will have this capability and Saudi Arabia won't have it. So that's one of their demands, and they have some other demands. And I think we disagree on the next issue. The Palestinian issue is on the table for the Saudis. Definitely, as long as the king is alive, it's a matter of honor. Salman, as long as he's there, that's the honor of the father, and that's his statement. As long as he's alive, they can't do anything after he promised that he would solve, and he gave some very clear-cut promises and commitments. What will happen after he's gone in the next generation? Will this issue be completely off the table? I don't think so, but it could become a bit less important. But to say that it completely won't be part of it, I think it's making our lives too easy. A response to that response, no, it's not what I said at all. I don't think it's going to happen. On the Palestinian topic, of course, Israel will have to act. I just said that this isn't the litmus test. I'm thinking from a Saudi perspective, and I'm trying, or the Saudi mindset, and I'm trying to think what motivates them. And you need to remember that at the end of the day, Riyadh is the capital of the Gulf, because we're talking about other countries, and it's important to bear in mind with the Emirates as well. Look, between Dubai and Iran, there are excellent trade relations spanning over 1,000 years. It wasn't created today. Some of the Emiratis families have, are descendants of Iranian families. And if you take off Iran, they're taking them off the cycle that connects them to a market economy. What I'm saying, and I'm saying this very cautiously, there is potential. I agree with what Yossi said. I also agree with Tamir. I just don't want people to think that I said absolutely not. It's an Israeli interest, of course, and any kind of compromise on the Palestinian issue is part of a regional detente, because it helps the thawing. And remember what Yoel said, between the Saudis and the Iranians, no agreement. No agreement won't cancel the bad blood that history brings their from a long time ago, if not from the dawn of history. And I'm convinced that the Saudis don't think for even one sec that, the Iranians have completely changed themselves. But what they could think, like Yoel said, like Tamir said, to mitigate conflicts, to moderate tensions. This is what's currently happening. And I wouldn't think about it as something that means that things are actually going back to the past, and the Saudi-Iranian tension is well known. It has a lot of layers, a lot of tiers, and it's indeed part of everything we see here. We have time for one last question. Now I'd like to drill down further. We talk about this detente, but what does it actually mean? Syria is returning to the fold, and it's being brought back to a great extent by Mohammed bin Salman. Some very interesting context between Mohammed bin Salman and Hamas, the release of prisoners. We've seen their visit. They conducted this kind of Hajj to Saudi Arabia. So what do you have to say about all these changes from an Israeli perspective? Is it like what the headlines, screamed at the time? The Middle East is changing and it's detrimental to us. It's a disaster. Or do any opportunities lie for Israel here as well? Look, Hamas, for example. We know what Saudi Arabia thinks about the Muslim Brotherhood. We don't need, it's part of that detente that you were talking about. If you're asking me, I'm not sure it's such a bad thing. Let me give you an example. Perhaps Saudi Arabia at a certain point, and it's not completely far-fetched, if it has any kind of dialogue or connection with Hamas, could mitigate tensions in times of crisis if and when this happens. But I think, when we look at the overall picture, I don't think we need to think that this is either a scandal or a festival. We have enough of that here right at home in Israel. We need to be on the same plane as the Middle East to enter a lab that's called a wiser Israel. Not necessarily a just Israel, but definitely a wiser Israel that knows how to connect with each and every country through the understanding of what is paining them, what's their pain points. I'm not talking about Iran, but I'm talking about, the good guys, the good countries from Yossi's presentation. And believe you me, you ain't seen nothing yet. There is tremendous potential, tremendous. And the further we go into the 21st century, all the ties we already have, and you can see that the entire story with the UAE, it's breaking all records, and we won't, blame anyone who was doubtful, because one can be doubtful. And it's true that the Abraham Accords is whitewashing a country which is not a democracy. Yes, I agree with you on that point. If anybody's familiar with the UAE, with Bahrain, anybody who's also familiar with the Saudi or the Moroccan rationale knows that Israel received a platform that it never had before. One could only dream of such a platform in the 20th century. Now the question, what can Israel do? What will Israel know to do? And I think if Israel prepares itself properly, if it studies the Middle East very carefully, with everything this implies, it means we need to speak in Egyptian, Moroccan, and the Saudi Arabian jargon, so to speak, then it will be very good for future generation Israelis. I don't know if it sounds optimistic. Let's say with the late Amil Habibi, it's always best to be an optimist, to go both ways. From optimism, let's move on to Iran. Look, in principle, Iran is improving its regional position, and the sequence of agreements it signed is a counterweight to the series of our agreements. And I think in general, there's this mirror image. When Iran is looking around it and see too many Israeli flags around its borders, it's trying to do the exact opposite and to balance this situation. So in this respect, Iran's diplomatic isolation isn't working. The fact that it approached China and Russia in the global world, in the world of global competition, and now it's a good neighborly relations strategy. This change is not positive because we understand, and let's not specify too much about Iran. But on the other hand, we never thought, and I don't think we should link some kind of we shouldn't create some kind of a regional security alliance against Iran. We don't want the restrictions of such a regional alliance, and we could only serve as a burden that would spoil everything for the entire Middle East if we introduce the security element. Our military security, defensive capabilities, we need to develop these on our own. We mainly need the U.S., and I don't think it has too many meanings, too much significance with respect to the military threat on Iran. If we need to reach such a situation in the future, hopefully it won't happen in the near future, but it's a situation we have to consider. But operationally speaking, it has no significance whatsoever. It has a different vector. As for the military status or position of Iran, the good news are not so good for the reasons I've listed. The other issue is the Palestinian issue. Here I do see some potential. This circle we need to turn into a square time and again, and we've despaired of all the options and all the strategies. I mean, we no longer can extract some kind of new energy from this. I think that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, because we can see the trend of the regional detente, we can use this energy in order to perhaps introduce new ideas. Now, we're going towards a huge change in the Palestinian arena anyhow, whether we want it or not. We don't have time to get into this. So I think there's this turbulent movement that's happening within the Palestinian arena. There's a strategic Gulf trend towards an agreement. We have our interest for security reasons and for other reasons that have to do with the identity of the land of Israel, the state of Israel. And I think that perhaps it could be, could happen on the day after, as we call it, in the Palestinian arena. There could be some new energy in this direction. I thank you for this fascinating discussion, and we'll now move on to the panel discussion.
So, hello again. In the short lecture that I will give now, I want to tie between two subjects that were mentioned and delve deeper to assess them. One is nuclear proliferation, and the second, normalization. Theoretically, these two topics are unrelated, but they are. In the 2030 vision of Saudi Arabia, there is a small part wasn't pushed the nuclear development, civilian, of course. The need to break away from the dependence on fossil fuels, of oil, is a central part of the vision and actions, positive some of them, of Mohammed bin Salman. How do we reduce the dependence on oil? Part of the solutions, nuclear energy. So the kingdom started marching on the nuclear path a long time ago, way before 2016, and in different tracks that I will mention. It gives this nuclear path various justifications, energy-wise and financial-wise. But truly, nuclear-wise, it has to do with inferiority and a serious concern from Iran beyond prestige in the Arab arena. Saudi officials say that it's only peaceful, but remember bin Salman himself that declared back when he was persona grata in the United States that if Iran will have a bomb, then Saudi Arabia will have one, and immediately. Mohammed bin Salman's brother Abdul Aziz, from a different mother, said that the kingdom has an interest. He didn't say it once, he repeats it several years. The kingdom has an interest to operate a independent nuclear cycle. They want to enrich uranium. This isn't new, despite the headlines from the recent weekend. These declarations and others intensify the fear that the Saudi interests are not only for electricity and water desalination and others. Like Tamir said and Uzi, the Saudis want to position themselves as equals facing Iran. If Iran can enrich uranium, then we can enrich uranium. I talked that the nuclear program, and there is a nuclear program, it has 4 pillars. The first is power plants. They want to produce electricity and desalinate water. They looked east, I'm sorry, look east, and see not only Iran, they see Abu Dhabi, UAE, that is a whole decade ahead of them, and built 4 plants. The Koreans built for them. 3 out of the 4 are already connected to the electricity grid and producing electricity. Saudi Arabia doesn't like this too much. The Saudis plan to build two plants. They already chose 2 locations in the Arab Gulf. I wanted to say the Persian, but no, the Arab Gulf. I assess that this time Seoul, not North Korea, South Korea, of course, will build these plants because of the experience they accumulated with building the Emirates plants. The Saudis are negotiating off and on with 3 American administrations: the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration, in order to reach an agreement, 1, 2, 3 agreement, for nuclear energy cooperation. The hindrance so far is that the Saudis are not willing to give up enriching uranium on their territory, and refuse, by the way, to sign the additional protocol of IAEA that will enable stronger monitoring. The other pillar of the Saudi program is research and development and research. In last year, a small research plant built in Argentina was built near Riyadh. So Argentina already finished this. They didn't enter the rods yet because there's a problem with the IAEA, but it's a low volume plant, mainly for teaching personnel, and I don't think this has anything to do with proliferation that should concern us. The third pillar of the Saudi nuclear program, and this is worrying, it's enriching uranium. It's not new. The Saudis declare for several years that they want to enrich uranium to fuel their sites that they're building, the reactors that they're building. 2 years ago, someone leaked to the Wall Street Journal, and it came out, a yellowcake facility. It's the first phase in the nuclear cycle, by the way, also for civilian and also for military uses. As we speak, as far as we know, as far as I know, and maybe you, until now, there is no uranium enriching facility in Saudi Arabia, but I can't rule out the possibility that it exists. The 4th field of the nuclear program in Saudi Arabia may be the most troubling, and it's what I call shortcuts. Saudi Arabia has a long year relations and multifaceted with Pakistan. There are many rumors about the Pakistani option. There are several ways in which Pakistan can assist Saudi Arabia when the time comes. Positioning warheads, fighter planes from Pakistan on Saudi soil, assisting in enriching uranium, and even giving a extended deterrence, as we know, from the past. And I send you to a deep research that we did in INSS about the Pakistan-Saudi Arabia relations. Also, Uzi and Tamir both related to something. The detente, what we see in the region now, the Saudi-Iranian agreement, doesn't change one bit the nuclear rationale of Saudi Arabia. Iran is still the central threat facing Saudi Arabia. The purpose of the deal with Iran, or the detente, is de-escalation, reducing tension. Mohammed bin Salman wants a nuclear program. He wants to glorify and strengthen his position. And as I said, he deals with the Americans for a collaboration program in nuclear issues. The agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States that is stuck became recently a component in the demands of Saudi Arabia from the United States in what has to do with normalization, and it all connects beyond armaments, guarantees facing Iran, and also solving the issue of Mohammed bin Salman's position in the United States. He wants to be accepted. Beyond all this, they want nuclear cooperation. But unlike UAE, that gave up enriching uranium on its soil, and they call the gold standard, the Saudis are not willing to give up enrichment and tie it all into the agreement. In the past, Saudi Arabia hid components in its nuclear program and its missile program. We remember this. And I believe that today, too, there are unknown components in the program. But look, it's not effective for Israel to oppose a nuclear program as long as it's civilian in Saudi Arabia, especially when there is one in UAE. The horses have long escaped from the barn. Between us and the Saudis, there is a quiet and long multi-year relations. It's maybe the least kept secret in the Middle East. Our Prime Minister declared many times and continues to say that he aspires to a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia. An Israeli-Saudi peace agreement, such a peace agreement is a valuable target. We should make concessions in various dimensions, also in the Palestinian issue, in order to get closer to normalization with Saudi Arabia. But, and this is a huge but, Israel must assess if the price of uranium enrichment, for instance, is something we can give in or give up. I think we should debate it. It's a good time to start now, as we didn't discuss the F-35 in the past, for instance. I believe agreement of Israel, even in silence, of granting Saudi Arabia the ability to enrich is too much of a price. That's my personal opinion. We can argue it. I think it's too high a price to pay. I want to sum up. Saudi Arabia chose a strategic choice in strengthening its ties with Israel. I think it aspires to normalization. It is marching in this direction slowly. There are positive developments, as Tamir said, and Uzi, slowly but surely. The kingdom will continue to emphasize its wish to move towards a Palestinian state. It will stick to the Arab initiative and continue quiet relations with Israel, as we've seen. Overflights that maybe will be approved of Arab Israelis and direct flights of Arab Israelis to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj are not full normalization. These are crumbs of normalization. Continuing this incremental normalization is a term that we coined here in INSS. Even when we have a thawing of the relations, and it's a matter of time until we will see such relations, it will be a different model from the Abraham Accords because of the specific sensitivities and circumstances with the Saudis. And what are they? In short, I will count them. There are those who oppose such normalization in the palace. Tamir and Uzi both spoke about it. In Riyadh, the father, Salman, is still alive, and as long as he's alive, it will probably be difficult to move forward in this regard. The second, Saudi population is conservative. If you read public polls, there is wide objection. About 70-80% of the population object to foreign normalization with Israel. The third thing is that Saudi Arabia has regional sensitivities. Iran pressures quietly and not quietly on the Saudis and other smaller Gulf states not to normalize relations with Israel, and this pressure has weight. The last thing, and also this is significant if the Saudis go forward with us, it's the Muslim world. We're talking about the custodian of the Muslim sites, and if they move forward with us, this may have a price for them. Last sentence before I conclude. The benefits that the Saudis wish for normalization are mainly from the Americans. It's true, I too assess that they are willing to be flexible. Hello, Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The benefits are mainly from the Americans, and they are willing, I think, to be flexible in the Palestinian arena, but Saudi Arabia will need to present some kind of achievement on the Palestinian issue, some kind of concession by Israel in the Palestinian arena. So it's true that Saudi Arabia has a realm of flexibility they can move in, and it makes sense that they will push forward with Israel, and we'll see in a year or two if I'm right, under the level of Palestinian state. Second thing I want to emphasize, an attempt to push the Saudis for quick normalization will only hinder this move and the chances of bringing it to fruition. We must let the Saudis move in their own pace, the pace of the desert. And the last thing, leaks coming out of Jerusalem or other places in Israel are very harmful and hinder the ability to bring the Saudis to the table. Some are led by political interests. The kingdom is very sensitive to these leaks, and in the past the relations between us and them, relating to some undisclosed meeting, the relations went back because the Saudis were angry at these leaks. Moreover, the more you want an agreement and declare day in and day out that you want it, you not only embarrass the Saudis, but you raise the future price for such an agreement. Thank you very much. I want to invite a colleague and friend, Brendan Friedman, Dr. Brendan Friedman, Director of Research at the Moshe Dayan Center, that will speak about the new regionality of Saudi Arabia. Brendan, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. So, I will say a few thank yous, but I know that I'm standing before you and the central speaker is here that knows really what's going on between the Saudis and Israelis. So I will try to be brief with my comments. So first, thank you, Professor Trachtenberg. Thank you, Tammy Hyman. Thank you, Yoel, for all his hard work as a partner in pushing this meeting. Thank you, dear audience, for your time, and the technical team of the INSS for the hospitality. In parenthesis, for Yoel's lecture about nuclear Saudi, if someone really wants to know how much MBS would want to acquire American nuclear technology, there are two American reports that the Congress issued researching this issue in the Trump administration with various pieces of information and emails about this subject. It's very interesting to read, and you will find it easily on Google. It's real. This wish to construct a nuclear program. But I wanted to talk today about nationality and self-reliance in the last decade in Saudi Arabia, because this is how I think we can give a broader framework to all these issues that we discussed about them today. I want to say a few things about how I see the new nationality in Saudi Arabia, the end of this current era, and talk about the global development, regional development, and local towards Saudi Arabia by MBS, the Crown Prince. First, I see this new nationality in Saudi Arabia, and Professor Rabi spoke about this before. One of the main changes that MBS brought to Saudi Arabia is, in fact, I would say the end of this division between the clergy, the people of the kingdom, of the crown, and the rest. MBS says there's no collaboration between these two traditional institutions. There is the crown and the rest. And this is a huge change. And we see this on the ground. And if there is such a change, then the kingdom is looking for a way to stabilize its own legitimacy, the crown. And I would say that the wish to rebuild the Saudi people with some kind of solidarity that is not only top down from the ruler to the ruled, but some kind of wish to build some kind of broad solidarity within the Saudi people. And there's a reason for this, a good reason. It's not just a move. There's an instrumental force here. Because what MBS's Saudi Arabia wants to do is to recruit the people to what he wants to do with his 2030 vision. And there are two central pillars here. One is to rebuild the economy, to construct a knowledge-based economy, and it's expressed there's a tendency in Western media to criticize this and say that it's just another mega project of Saudi Arabia, but it's something very important for MBS, the Nome project. You can't disregard this. And since the war in Ukraine, Saudi Arabia has the resources to materialize this. The second pillar is the wish to rebuild the defense mechanisms and institutions. I know there's a tendency to see what happened in Yemen since March 2015 and say that Saudi Arabia doesn't have a serious army, and I don't argue with this. It was a huge failure on their part, and I think the Saudis saw it as we all saw it. And in 2018, the Saudis declared a program of change in the defense institution, defense transformation plan, and they unified all the various missions that have to do with the United States, and they wish to rebuild the Saudi military. And it will take a generation, a whole generation. And because it will take a whole generation, their national aspirations are very important. But the wish to recruit the people, to revitalize the solidarity and nationality of the Saudi people, territorial nationality, it's also some kind of, like Charles Tilly said, the state creates a war, and the war creates the state. State makes the war, war makes the state. In Saudi Arabia, yes, it could be that the war in Yemen was a failure, but the wish to unify the people around the threats, it's still there. And I want to say, in short, three things about these threats. First, and I'm very happy that Tamir talked about the discourse of the American departure or withdrawal. I think it's right. The Americans are trying to redefine their relations with the Middle East in general, and there's a tendency to overstate this American departure from the region, and I don't think this is precise. But on the other hand, what Professor Rabi said is also very true, that in the perception of the Saudis, there's great fear, that it's not like in the past. We don't have this pact with oil, fuel, or of oil for security, and they're afraid. They are scared. So this is first. The second issue, no less important, there's the energy transformation. The Saudis see it. They see the need to diversify the economy. They know this change will take time, several decades, but they have to start to build themselves from now. So, right, the war in Ukraine gave them another few years to plan it. But the year 2050 is not far. Second, it's regional. The expansion of Iran, and we know this in the issue of missiles and nuclear capabilities, and expansion of their maritime capabilities that are no less important. And also, I would say the Arab Spring, the uprising in 2010 and 11, and mainly the development in Syria and Yemen, and the feeling in Saudi Arabia from, I would say, 2012 and 13, that they are alone, that the Americans are not so much interested in what's going on there. And also, I think this gives them a feeling in Saudi Arabia that they have to rely on themselves. And also the failure of Saudi Arabia with its intervention in there and in Yemen. I would say that the strategic change of the Saudis, that they must be more independent, it's still there despite the failures that they led. It could be that these failures even strengthened their wish, and this is how I see it. And third issue, and no less important, there is MBS himself. Uzi said he's the X factor, his personality, his style, this is something different. And I think that national pride that he's trying to bring to the Saudi people, the 2/3 of the people under the age of 35, it's a generation or several generations that have no collective memory, that many of the things that we spoke about them here, they lack. So it's important to mention this. And of course, Islam. And here I want to close with the point that I opened with, and that's the issue of the change with the legitimacy of the crown. From the 90s, they began to recognize that radical Islam, if it's the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafi Jihadi movement, it's a kind of threat to the crown in Saudi Arabia. If Islam became a danger for the family in Saudi Arabia, they need to find a new mechanism, a new formula to take over and control the kingdom. What we see now is the Muslim Brotherhood, that after 2011 and the uprising in Arab countries that demanded the Dawla Madiniyah, which means the civilian state or social state, and this means Saudi Arabia without the crown. We do not need the king. This became a threat for the family of Saudi. And there's the Salafi Jihadi sect. And of course, remember the Islamic State. And they saw and see that the Islamic State threatened the house of Saudi publicly. So, in essence, I see the change in Saudi Arabia as a change in the framework of nationality. And here, and I really will leave the issue of normalization with Israel for the central speaker after me, I really think that if we look at this issue through the prism of nationality, we can imagine a move of normalization as a Saudi interest, because regionality is something that they need, because they are not prepared today, maybe in the next decade, to rely only on themselves as they wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Brandon. And now I'm truly delighted and excited and honored to invite Mr. Ronen Levy, MFA Director General Ronen Levy, who is also called Maoz. Some of you know him by that name. Served for almost 30 years in the security establishment, in the intel community, and in high-ranking positions in the security establishment. In his recent positions in the ISA and the head of the relations with Africa and the NSC, he was one of the main architects in the establishment of the Abraham Accords and the normalization with the Arab world. Ronen Levi Maoz started out as Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in January of 2023. The topic of his talk, Cooking Normalization from Concept to Practice. Ronen, the floor is yours. Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers, Professor Trachtenberg, Uzi Rabi, my dear friend, Tamir Hyman, Ali Savir, shukran. First of all, I'm truly delighted to be here. As you understood from this brief CV and what you heard at the end of this CV, I have been serving as Director General of the MFA since January. And this entire subject of research institutes are quite new to me, but Tamir summoned me, so of course I came, as always. I have to tell you, as I was driving here and thinking about this session, I was thinking about just how far we've come over this past 3 years. And I can also tell you that I was thinking about what other distances we will cover, how far we will reach over this year and in the years to come. I truly believe in that, and I'm going to refer to that later. As you all understand, I'm still in office, so it will be a bit difficult for me to mention any specific names, especially names that are currently relevant or could be relevant in the future, but I think we will manage to somehow get along. So what I was thinking about was the moment before the signing in the summer of 2022. We landed in Abu Dhabi, except for the well-known heat and humidity. There was this feeling of something new as we were flying above Saudi Arabia, and all of a sudden you get to see a new landscape which you didn't see before, and then you land in Abu Dhabi. And its neighboring country is Iran, which is also the topic of today's conference, and you feel like you're in a completely different place. And you understand the geostrategic significance and the change in the paradigm that is about to unfold here. And this change would ultimately impact Israel's economic policy, security policy. And I think that the two superpowers, both Saudi Arabia and Iran, in the terms of the Muslim world and their relations that today as well project on the entire region, what could even say that they project farther than this region. I think they will also impact in the near future the decisions that countries will or won't take, or their policy over the next few days or months. The gist of my professional life was devoted to the strengthening of Israel's security, whether through the thwarting in the operational sector in the Gaza Strip versus Sinai, or in broader context regarding the decision of a policy and executing it when I established the Department for Special Relations in Africa and the Middle East. And I see what I'm doing today as Director General of the MFA as an integral part of this sequence, much more open, overt diplomacy rather than secret or clandestine diplomacy. But in all of my capacities, there is always or has always been the element of interpersonal relations. And this is a point I'm going to address later because it's a very important component for success, because even when we're talking about a dialogue between countries, the people who are actually engaged in the dialogue are people, human beings. And the explicit advantage of the MFA, on top of its expertise and specialization in foreign relations and a broad deployment of missions and the access the broad deployment and access to decision makers in the different countries, we consider it great importance in this broad deployment in order to strengthen existing ties and in establishing relations with some other countries as well. So every mission, as it is called, is an embassy, and every such embassy is a certain hub where one can depart from and take things further, both to enhance and even create something new. Just a few weeks ago, I had visited a certain country in Europe, a country which we operate with another third country in Africa. There isn't any geographic linkage or connection, but there are other connections. You identify these connections and you try to create this connection that will ultimately be beneficial to all parties. So as we look at the map of the world, beyond the 108 missions of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these 108 missions or embassies are responsible for 166 countries that Israel has ties with. Sometimes there are ambassadors who are not located in a specific country but are still responsible for that country. And what stands out here are the countries that are in white. This is what we're interested in. I say that there are some bright white countries and other countries that their white is less emphasized to the extent that one can find shades and hues in white. And that's also our target. This is our target. Tamir, you probably are familiar with that from Intel. You decide on a goal, a target, so there's the region that you work on, and that's where we're geared towards. As somebody who was involved in diplomacy, both behind the scenes, but also more out in the open, I have to tell you, I don't think that there's any specific recipe or formula for establishing relations with a country, but there are a few things that need to be done. It's definitely about timing and the coming together of interests that can all bring an opportunity, just like in business. I believe that the agreements that we signed, once there was this meeting point of interest, that it was the timing and the right people, it really happened very quickly. These things can sometimes happen very, very quickly. It progressed very quickly, but we also need to understand the elements, the components, in order to inject some more content to our discussion here. So the main components are timing, a meeting point of interest, and interpersonal relations. I think that we can't take out any of these components if we wish to establish relations with a country or to renew relations with a country. These elements all need to be intertwined, and once they are identified, we need to act quickly. Why act quickly? I think this entire forum is very much familiar with the neighborhood we live in. Usually, we encounter surprises in this region, and usually these surprises are negative surprises, so there's always a reason why not to have that party. So once there's an opportunity, you need to seize it in both hands, to act, to find the strong and brave leader, because usually the other side, if it doesn't succeed, they have much more to lose than we do. We, of course, take that into account. So I was thinking, what example can I give you to demonstrate, to illustrate what is normalization? How do you create normalization without truly drilling down into the very specifics of these matters? So I decided to give as an example my personal involvement in advancing relations with Chad. Chad is a country in Africa. It received its independence from France in the 1960s, a population of over 17 million. It's a very big country. And immediately after that, we formed relations with it, but in the early 1970s, you know, speaking of Saudi Arabia, and regardless of the Yom Kippur, the 73 war, it severed its ties with Israel. And ever since, until the renewal of these ties in 2019, we didn't have any relations with Chad. There were several attempts made by Israel to renew its relations with Chad. All failed for various reasons. In March of 2018, I assumed my position at the NSC. I was on a loan from the ISA, the Israel Security Agency. I really didn't know much about diplomacy, foreign relations, mainly with our neighbors, maybe a bit beyond that, but mainly more on the operative side, thwarting activities, but definitely I was never involved in establishing relations. And one of the assignments I received was to allow direct flight lines above Africa so that Israeli airliners could reach more quickly and for cheaper price, and to make it more convenient for the passengers to reach South Africa and South America. If you look at the map, it means crossing from Israel. In order to cross from Israel, you need to pass through here above Libya and Chad, or over Sudan and Chad. 3 countries. 2 of them are necessary, and anyhow we don't have ties with any of these 3 countries. One of them was colored white, Chad, and today, as you can see, it's yellow. So what do we do? What do we do? We start looking for our contacts to see who's the actual decision maker, who's the ruler, in order to act quickly and reach that decision maker as quickly as possible for the decision to be reached, and then perhaps after that to advance to other things. But it's kind of an opening in the door that we can set foot through, and we did that with some other countries as well. We have normalization with all of them to find a crack in the door that we can enter through, that opening through that crack. Chad seemed very promising. I can tell you that we had 3 parallel channels in our communications with Chad. One promising channel was chosen, ultimately one of the president's sons. So we met with him in a clandestine way. There was very good interpersonal relations. He's a very charismatic guy, very clever guy. And you understand, okay, we formed a relationship here. Because when it's there, it's there. And it was there. So indeed, the 2 other options, we lowered our profiles there. We decided to advance in one main track in order not to generate too much noise, just so that you understand how quickly it proceeds when it proceeds quickly. So the first meeting took place in June of 2018. We had several clandestine meetings with them abroad. We also brought him in Israel, but nobody knew about it. And then in September 2018, we already had a first meeting with the Prime Minister and the contacts as part of the UN conference in one of the hotels. Nobody knew about it. We talked about milestones there. November 2018, 2 months after that, the late Idris Deby came to Israel, and that's when he declared his desire to renew Chad's relations with Israel. And at the end of January 2019, or maybe it was the beginning of February 2019, Prime Minister Netanyahu came for a one-day visit in Chad, where we signed the renewal of the relations and his return, just to show you the connection between the countries. When he returned, he flew over the airspace of Sudan. We received an exceptional permission from Sudan at the time. At the time, nobody knew about the relations with them, and there was a phone call from the head of the Sudanese Intel directorate. That's, you know, maybe I can tell you this story at another opportunity. It's even a bit comical. Chad, actually, the way I see it, was the opening of the normalization. That was the first step, even though we still don't have an agreement with it, and we did it almost on our own without any partners such as the US or any other superpower. But
כשיש לך הצלחה
You know,
מסוימת,
in these matters, when you experience
אז זה מביא גם
success,
חברים.
that always brings along
לכן אני
some
חושב שגם
more
אם יהיה לנו
success. And I think therefore that
בעתיד
if
עוד
in
הסכם
the future
נורמליזציה,
we have another
אז זה
normalization
לא יהיה מדינה
agreement,
אחת, זה
then
יהיה
it
אולי
won't be
שתיים,
with only one country. It perhaps will be with
שלוש.
2 or even 3 countries.
אני רוצה להגיד מילה על
I'd
הסיפור
like
האישי.
to say one thing about the
כי
personal story,
כשאתה בא למדינה שאין
personal
לך קשרים
aspect,
איתה,
because when you come to a country that you
מעבר
don't
להלם
have
הראשוני שאתה
ties
נוחת
with,
במדינה,
in
והתרבות
addition to that
האחרת,
initial shock
אולי
when you
תפיסת העולם, וגם
land in a
הדדית,
different
הם
country,
תופסים
a
אותנו
different
באופן
culture,
אחר.
and a different worldview, and it's mutual. They also perceive us as something very different,
ואנחנו תופסים אותם באופן אחר.
and we perceive them
ואני אומר
as
לכם, אני
something
הייתי מופתע
different. And I
במרבית
was
מהמקרים,
surprised in most
לטובה.
cases, surprised for the better, I have to
ועם
say.
צ'אד שהוא הגיע לפה
And with
בפעם
Chad, when
הראשונה
he
באופן
came here
חשאי,
for the first time, and
לקחתי אותו
it was
לירושלים,
still done in secret, and I
למזרח
took him to
ירושלים.
Jerusalem, to East Jerusalem,
ושם הוא ראה למעשה
where
דו-קיום, שאנחנו
he actually saw
לא כולנו
coexistence.
מדברים עליו, אבל
We don't always
Muslims,
talk about it, but you know,
נוצרים,
Muslims,
יהודים,
Christians, Jews,
אפילו עוד דתות,
and
שנמצאים
other
כולם
religions,
בקילומטר
all
רבוע אחד,
living in one
ביחד,
square
קונים
kilometer,
ביחד,
eating together,
הולכים במסדרונות
doing their
ביחד,
shopping together, walking
בסמטאות.
through corridors and
הלכנו גם
alleys
ליפו,
together. We
על הטיילת
also
גם בתל
visited
אביב, הוא ראה
Jaffa
את הצד
and
האחר
the boardwalk
של
in
ישראל.
Tel Aviv. He saw another side of Israel.
ראה קדמה, ראה
He
טכנולוגיה,
saw progress,
אמר
modernity,
לי, "תשמע,
technology. And then he said, you know what, Maoz?
שונה לחלוטין
It's so different
ממה שאנחנו מכירים ואיך שאנחנו תופסים, אפילו
than
איך
how we
שאבא שלי
perceive it, how we imagined it, even from
תופס
the
את
way my
הדברים.
father perceives things.
והדברים האלה
So
מאוד
these
מאוד מאוד חשובים.
things are
מאוד מאוד
extremely
חשובים
important. They're
להראות
extremely important. It's so important to show
אורחים החדשים, אני
these
קורא להם,
new
שמגיעים
guests,
אלינו,
as I call them,
הצדדים
who come to visit
הטובים
us,
ולא
to show them the
לא
good
בהכרח
sides, not
מה
good sides,
שלפעמים הם רואים
not necessarily what they sometimes
בערוצי הטלוויזיה
see
השונים.
on the news, on TV.
אני הייתי במדינה ערבית לא מזמן,
I recently visited an Arab country. It was
לקראת סוף הסבב הנוכחי,
towards the end of this
ואמרתי, בוא
last
נראה מה
round,
רואים.
this last campaign,
ופתחתי
and
את
I
הערוץ
said, let's see what you can see on the news. So I turned on the
הטלוויזיה
TV,
המקומי,
on the local channel,
וכשנפגשתי עם האישיות, אמרתי לו,
and
תשמע,
when I met with that
אחד
person,
מהישראלים האלה,
I said, wow, listen,
תאמין לי,
these Israelis, believe you me,
אתה מזהה שם את המגמתיות ואת החד צדדיות.
you see how one-sided it is, how biased,
אתה מבין גם איך זה משפיע על האוכלוסייה
and
ועל
you
דעת הקהל.
understand what an impact that has on the
מה
general
שמפתיע, אבל,
population, on public opinion. But
שבאזורים
the
מסוימים,
surprising thing is that in certain,
גם באזורים
areas,
באפריקה, שהם פחות
even in areas in Africa,
פחות תופסים את העין, שאנחנו עושים סקרים,
which people sometimes
אתה
pay
מזהה
less
שם
attention
אהדה,
to, whenever we
ואפילו
conduct
רצון
polls,
לקרבה
you can
לישראל.
identify some sympathy
מתוך
for
רצון לייצר
Israel and
יציבות,
even a desire
לייצר
to
ביטחון
come closer to Israel in order
תעסוקתי,
to establish
להביא קדמה,
stability,
להביא
job
חקלאות,
security, to bring
ולהביא
in
עולמות אחרים שהם כן
progress,
רוצים.
modernity, agriculture,
ופה יש לנו
things
הרבה
that they
יתרונות.
want. And here on these matters we
את
have advantages,
וזה בדיוק מה שאנחנו גם
and that's exactly
מתכוונים ואנחנו עושים
what we mean to do
במגעים.
and what we do
שלנו עם
in
המדינות
our
השונות,
communications
שצובעות
with the
בלבן
different countries that
הידידותי
are
של
painted in a
של הלבן.
friendly white.
יש עניין למדינות לכונן ולחדש יחסים עם
Countries
ישראל.
have an interest in
ראיתי את זה גם
establishing
כשפרשתי,
relations with Israel. I saw this when
שפנו
I
אליי
retired,
גורמים ממדינות שונות,
when various elements
וגם
from different
בחמשת
countries
החודשים
approached me,
האחרונים,
and in the last 5 months in my position now,
ויש מגעים עם הרבה מדינות,
and there are relations,
האם
contacts
כולם
with
הבשילו?
other
לא בטוח.
countries. Will they all
אבל
materialize?
בהכרח יש כיוון חיובי.
Not certain, but there are
כמו
positive
שאמרתי, צריך
trends.
שהתנאים,
As I
העיתוי,
said, the
המפגש
timing, the
אינטרסים,
conditions, the
יבשילו,
joining of
חלקם
interest have
אנחנו
to
עוזרים לזה,
materialize.
חלקם
We
יבואו
have
עם
to
הזמן,
assist in this. Some will take time,
אבל בהכרח יש השפעה
but there is
להסכמים
an influence
הקודמים,
of the previous
תיירות,
agreements,
והסחר המדהים
tourism,
שיש
commerce
עם האמירויות,
that we have with UAE,
הקשר הטוב שיש עם
the good
בחריין,
relations we have with Bahrain,
הקשר הטוב
the
והתיירות
good
שיש עם
relations
מרוקו.
and tourism with Morocco.
שלושת המדינות האלה,
These
שהם
three
למעשה
countries that are
הבולטות,
the most
למעשה איזשהו
prominent.
מנוע.
They
כולם מסתכלות עליהם. כל
are
המדינות שצבועות
like an
לבן,
engine, a driver
הלבן,
of positive,
היותר נחמד, מסתכלות
driving to
עליהם.
white. And other countries look at them.
מסתכלות וגם שואלות.
They look and they ask.
שואלות את צ'אד גם.
As they ask Chad.
מדינות ישראל כל הזמן בבורות עם צ'אד,
Countries
בודקות דופק, מה
always
קורה.
check the pulse. What's going on?
שני משפטים לפני סיום.
Two sentences before I conclude.
אני חזרתי בשבוע שעבר מביקור ראשון בארצות הברית,
In the United States, my first
בתפקידי הנוכחי.
visit in this current
יכול להגיד
position.
שהיו שם פגישות
I can
מאוד
tell you
מאוד
that I had
מעניינות,
very interesting
מאוד
meetings,
תורמות.
very positive, contributing.
יש פה מחויבות
There is a commitment
אמריקאית להרחבת
by the US
מעגל הנורמליזציה
to
ברחבי
broadening
העולם.
the circle of normalization
אני
around
חושב
the world.
שהנורמליזציה עם
I
סעודיה
think
זה
normalization
צעד
with
חשוב
Saudi
מאוד.
Arabia is an important step,
אך במסגרת מעמד זה
in
אסור לנו
this
להזניח
realm we cannot
אפיקים במדינות אחרות,
shirk other
אולם אפשר לממש את
responsibilities in other
הפוטנציאל
countries,
עוד לפני סעודיה,
and maybe the potential can be materialized before Saudi
והן
Arabia.
חשובות לא פחות אגב.
They are no less important, by the way.
לסיכום,
In conclusion,
ואני מקווה שבחודשים הקרובים
I hope that in the next few months,
אולי נעדכן את המפה,
maybe we will update the map.
אולי אפילו בכנס הבא,
Maybe even in the
בעזרת
next
השם, נעדכן
conference,
את המפה,
God
יהיה
willing,
פחות אזורים
we will have less
לבנים, שזה
white,
עושה רק טוב
and it will
למדינת
all be
ישראל,
good.
עושה
Good
רק
for the
טוב
state of
לאזור,
Israel, good for the
אין
region.
ואקום,
No vacuum.
במקומות שאנחנו לא נמצאים,
Wherever we are not
בדרך כלל
there, usually
גורמים
elements
לא שאנחנו רוצים
that
נמצאים
we
שם.
do not want enter.
אז תודה רבה לכם.
So thank you all very much.
תודה רבה למנכ"ל משרד
Thank you,
החוץ.
Director General of Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
אני שמח לנעול את ערב העיון הקצר הזה. נגענו על קצה המזלג
Conference we touched
בסעודיה, בסביבה
on
האסטרטגית
Saudi Arabia,
של
the
ישראל.
strategic environment of the state of Israel
המכון
and the region.
בהובלת פרופסור מנו
NSF led
טרכטנברג,
by Professor
ביחד עם
Manuel
האלוף במילואים
Trachtenberg,
תמיר
together
אמן,
with Major
זיהו
General
את
Reserve
חשיבות
Tamir Ayman,
הנושא
identified the
של
importance
המפרץ
of the
הערבי.
subject of the Arab
למרות
Gulf.
מנעד הנושאים הרחב שהמכון
the broad
מטפל בו
spectrum
ומאפשרים
of
לי
fields
כראש
that
התוכנית
we deal
לקיים מחקרי עומק, כנסים
We are
כמו הכנס
able
הזה,
to
ואף
dive
להנחיל
deep
את
into
הידע
subjects like
שנצבר
this
פה
and to
במכון
instill the information
לגופים
that we learn here
רלוונטיים
to other
בישראל.
bodies and organizations
אני
and
מניח
people in
כי
Israel.
כל משתתפי
I
הכנס
assume that all the
בבית ואלה
participants,
שיושבים איתנו
those
כאן,
that are with us here
מבינים
and
היטב
you at
כי
home,
ערב הסעודית
understand very well that Saudi
היא מדינת
Arabia
מפתח
is a
בעבור
key
ישראל.
state for Israel.
היא מציבה לפתחנו
It
הזדמנויות,
poses for us opportunities,
בראש ובראשונה
first
בהיבט
and foremost
הנורמליזציה,
with the issue of normalization,
אך היא מציבה
but
בפנינו גם
also
אתגרים,
poses challenges.
בראש ובראשונה
First
בהיבטים של
and
תפוצה
foremost,
גרעינית.
things that have to do with nuclear
המפרץ הערבי,
proliferation. The Arab
כן,
Gulf,
כן, המפרץ
yes,
הערבי,
the
לא
Arab
טעיתי,
Gulf, I did not
הוא
make a
משמעותי
mistake, is
והוא חשוב.
significant, important,
הוא מרכזי בניהול
central
סדר היום,
in managing the
לא רק
agenda,
האזורי,
not only in the region,
אלא גם הגלובלי.
but the global.
מדובר בגוש
We're
עשיר
talking about a
ויציב
rich
של
and
מדינות,
stable
בוודאי
block
ביחס
of
למרחב
countries,
הערבי,
certainly relating to the Arab
שהוא ברובו
realm,
מרחב
that
כושל,
is mostly
שנתמך על ידי
undergoverned,
אותן מדינות מפרץ.
supported
ערביות.
by the Arab
המונרכיות הן
states.
דינמיות,
Monarchies are dynamic.
הן משתנות, הן
They're
מתעוררות,
changing, they're awakening,
הן עולות,
they are rising.
בעוד המרחב
While
הערבי
the Arab
שוקע
realm
במידה
is
רבה.
in the
תהליך
decline.
השקיעה הזה לא החל היום, הוא
This
החל מזמן, הוא אץ
decline
בעקבות
started long
האביב
ago,
הערבי.
but was
מאז,
intensified
בעשור
since the
האחרון,
Arab Spring.
בריאד,
In the last
בדוחה
decade in Riyadh, in
ובאבו
Doha,
דאבי
and
מתנהל
Abu Dhabi,
סדר היום
there
הבין-ערבי,
is the
סדר היום האזורי. על פי
intra-Arab
מדינות
agenda.
המפרץ, יישק דבר.
According to the Gulf states, things
עד כדי
move
כך,
on.
אני פותח סוגריים, עד כדי כך רע
So much
מצבן
so,
של מדינות ערב
so bad
האחרות, לא
is
המפרציות,
the other Arab
שאם
countries,
בודקים על פי
but if we
פרמטרים
assess
היום,
according to
על פי
parameters
פרמטרים
today,
סוציו-אקונומיים
according to socioeconomic
בלבד, הרי
parameters
שהתנאים
alone,
חמורים מאלה שהיו
conditions
לפני
are
עשור,
worse than what we
ערב
had
האביב
a decade
הערבי.
ago
הקרקע
before the
פוריה
Arab
לזעזועים,
Spring.
שאנחנו לא יודעים מתי הם יתפרצו ולאיזה כיוונים. מבין מדינות המפרץ הערביות, אולי מבין כל מדינות ערב, סעודיה היא החשובה ביותר. היא הכלכלה הגדולה ביותר במזרח התיכון, שומרת המקומות הקדושים לאסלאם. שטחה אגב, כשליש משטחה של ארצות הברית, שטחה ככל שטח מערב אירופה, גם יחד. והממלכה הזאת, ולא נגענו בזה, אולי בכנס הבא, עוברת מהפכה מלמעלה למטה, טופ דאון, מהפכה שמשנה את פניה. הממלכה מנווטת את דרכה במזרח התיכון, במזרח תיכון דינמי ומאתגר, מול האיום המרכזי עליה, איראן, ומול מתחרות אפילו בקרב שכנותיה. פותח סוגריים, איחוד האמירויות, סוגר סוגריים. העומד בראשה, מוחמד בן סלמן, מבקש להיות מלך. בקרוב. הוא מנסה לכנס תחתיו את כל מדינות ערב, ואני מדגיש את כל מדינות ערב, גם את מצרים ותחתיו, ולהובילן. בזירה הפנימית הוא מנסה להנדס סעודיה חדשה. בזירה האזורית, דיברנו על זה, הוא מוביל דטנט. וגלובלית הוא מנסה לייצר משוואת יחסים חדשה עם ארצות הברית ולהוביל מדיניות עצמאית וגם לאפשר למעצמות אחרות, סין, רוסיה, דריסת רגל במפרץ. משפט אחרון, אולי הכי חשוב בעיניי. לצערי הציבור הישראלי, זו הכללה, אבל לפעמים הכללות הן נכונות, הציבור הישראלי חסר ידע באשר למדינות המפרץ. ישראלים נוסעים לדובאי, בעיקר כיעד תיירותי, אולי עסקי, אך לא באמת מכירים את המפרץ הערבי. אנחנו במכון מתכוונים לשנות זאת ולהנגיש את הידע לציבור. כרגע ישנם חוקרים מעטים, רובם יושבים פה בחדר הזה, לטוב ולרע, שמתעסקים במפרץ הערבי. אני לא מכליל פרשנים או כאלה שיושבים או יושבות מול פני טלוויזיה. חוקרים אמיתיים, נדרשים חוקרים אמיתיים בתחום החשוב הזה לעתיד המזרח התיכון ולעתיד ישראל. ואני רוצה לנצל את הבמה ולקרוא לסטודנטים ללמוד ולהתמחות באזור המרתק והחשוב הזה. תודה רבה וערב טוב.